The girl flinched as the cowboy handed her the rifle, not because it was heavy, but because it was unthinkable. The sun hung low over the Texas fields, and the wind kicked dust into the space between them. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't mocking. He just waited, his hat tilted back, sleeves rolled up, boots planted like tree stumps. The rifle rested across his palms, not as a threat, but an invitation. She stared at it like it might explode. In Japan, she had cleaned blood from stretchers, scrubbed operating tables, learned to be invisible. Guns were things men used, men who shouted orders, who beat failure out of you with their fists. She had never even touched one, and now the enemy was offering her one freely. "Just aim," he said softly. "Breathe in. Let it go." The girl reached out. Her fingers brushed the stock. In that instant, the war cracked, not with a bang, but with a whisper. She took the rifle. The heat settled like a weight across Kozue's shoulders as the truck doors clanked open. Dust bloomed around her bare feet, and the sky, bigger than anything she had ever seen, pressed down with a silence so vast it felt like judgment. The other women climbed down behind her, blinking under the Texas sun, their movements stiff from days of seasick travel and years of war. Kozue didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since Nagasaki. Her mouth was a line, her eyes unreadable, her uniform hanging from her body like fabric on a broken scarecrow. Every breath she took felt like an intrusion. Every sound, boots in dirt, cattle lowing in the distance, reminded her she had survived something she was never supposed to survive. There was no shouting, no dogs, no rifles pointed at their backs, just a handful of men in denim and sweat-stained hats, their expressions unreadable under the brims. These were not the soldiers she had imagined in nightmares. They stood with the posture of men used to lifting hay, not prisoners. One of them scratched his chin and said something to the other, but the words floated away in the heat. Kozue scanned the fence line. No barbed wire, no towers, no loudspeakers barking orders, just cattle pens, barns, and windmills spinning lazily in the distance. A cowboy stepped forward, papers in hand. He looked barely older than her brother had been when he left for the Pacific Front. He read out names. The voices of the other girls, weak and cracked, responded. When he reached her, she didn't answer. Another woman whispered for her, "Kozue." The cowboy frowned, tried to repeat it, then gave up and wrote it down phonetically. Kozue didn't move. She didn't blink. She had learned long ago that motion drew attention, and attention was a currency she couldn't afford. The group was led toward a long wooden building that looked like a stable, not a prison. Inside, it was cool and dim. A cot sat in one corner. A table with a ledger and a basin occupied the other. A young man with sunburned cheeks and a stethoscope motioned for Kozue to sit. She did. He lifted her wrist gently, like it might break in his hands. Her pulse fluttered, slow, tired, untrusting. She didn't meet his eyes. She was used to being handled like a sack of rice or ignored entirely. He murmured something to the cowboy nearby. The word 68 floated in the air. Kozue didn't know the number, but she understood the tone. Disbelief. Pity. She hated it. She hated the way their faces shifted when they looked at her, not like an enemy, not like a soldier, but like a girl. And worse, a weak one. The medic stepped back. Kozue remained on the cot, staring at the floorboards. One of the cowboys placed a blanket over her shoulders. It was rough wool, still warm from the sun. She didn't react. Not because she was grateful, but because she didn't know if she was allowed to be. Gratitude had no place in war. It had been scrubbed out of her, alongside comfort, softness, want. Later, they showed her where she would sleep. The room was shared, but quiet. Her cot had a mattress, a real one. Her fingers sank into it slightly. There was a bar of soap, a tin cup, a small towel. She sat down slowly, knees trembling. For the first time in what felt like 100 years, there was no concrete under her, no sirens overhead, just a window open to the breeze and the distant sound of cattle. That night, she caught her reflection in a cracked mirror above the basin. What stared back was not a soldier, not a threat, just a body, a map of war. Her collarbones jutted like branches, her cheeks had hollowed into shadows, her eyes, once fierce with duty, looked empty. Kozue had always believed she would die before being captured. That was the promise. That was the code. Better to vanish in flames than end up in foreign hands. But now she was here, alive, under the roof of those she was taught to fear. And they were offering her stew, blankets, quiet. She didn't trust any of it, but part of her, some broken, bitter shard, wanted to. Back in Nagoya, that thought would have been enough to shame her entire bloodline. Wanting, longing. To want meant weakness. To hope meant delusion. Kozue had learned this before her 14th birthday, beneath the concrete eaves of the Teishintai School for Girls, where the walls echoed with the rattling chants of national slogans and the clicking of boots on polished floors. They had told her she was special, chosen, that the emperor needed her hands, not to carry a pen or a child's doll, but to carry stretchers, wipe blood, stitch the limbs of soldiers who were not supposed to cry, but often did. She had swallowed those lessons like bitter medicine. Bushido was sacred, suffering was a form of love, and surrender? Surrender was a betrayal so severe it blackened the names of your ancestors. The instructors said it without blinking. If you are captured, you will not live long enough to regret it. They will shame you, defile you, feed you to pigs. Kozue had nodded. They all had. Some girls wept quietly at night, their tears soaked into blankets that barely warmed. Kozue did not cry. Her mother had taught her that tears were for women who could afford them. She was not one of them. When the air raids began, everything changed. At first the sirens came hours apart, then minutes, then none at all, just the distant rumble, the orange sky, the sudden screaming. Her brother Satoshi went to war. Her father's ship never returned. Her mother, thinner with every month, started boiling weeds in water and calling it soup. Kozue stopped asking questions. By then, she had already begun working in the military hospital, scrubbing floors until her knees bled, folding blood-slick sheets, tending to men whose faces were more bandage than flesh. The other nurses had that same hollowed-out stare, girls barely older than her, with calloused hands and stories they never told. The only phrase repeated was, "Endure for the emperor." And Kozue did. Even when the dead were left in hallways for lack of burial space, even when she watched a boy her age scream for his mother as they amputated his leg, even when she began losing the ability to taste anything but metal. The Americans were distant devils, painted in stories, warnings, whispered threats. She had never seen one, but she knew them well. They had claws. They shot prisoners for sport. One officer told them they wore necklaces made of Japanese teeth. It sounded absurd, and yet she believed it, because belief, even in horror, was safer than doubt. Then came the silence. One day, the announcement stopped. Officers stopped yelling, nurses huddled in corners whispering. The emperor had spoken. His voice came crackling through an old radio, thin and trembling. He told them the war was over. They were to endure the unendurable. Kozue remembered staring at the speaker and thinking, He sounds like he's already gone. Within days, she was on a truck. No goodbyes, no last salutes. Just the rattle of the road, and girls, too starved to even whisper. At the port, American Marines waited, not with guns drawn, but with papers, masks, and crates of rations. Kozue kept her eyes on the ground, expecting at any moment to be dragged away. They were herded onto a ship, but it wasn't dark. There were bunks, meals, soap. She didn't touch the food. Her stomach had folded in on itself long ago. On the third day at sea, another girl said she had seen an American soldier smile. Kozue thought it must be a trick. Smiling meant games. Games meant cruelty. She refused to leave her bunk except to relieve herself. Even then, she did so with her back to the wall, waiting for the first blow. But it never came. She began watching the ocean, endless, slow, uncaring, a world apart from the ash-filled skies of home. When the ship docked in California and they were transferred to trains, she expected whips. Instead, they were given water bottles. On the train, she looked out the window and saw children playing with kites. She closed her eyes. If they were going to shoot her, she wished they would do it quickly. But days passed, and no bullet came. No guard barked orders, no punishment followed silence. Instead, Kozue found herself waking to the sound of chickens and the smell of smoke, not from bombs, but from bacon, firewood, coffee. The Texas ranch didn't feel like prison. Not exactly. It felt more like an unfinished dream where the rules hadn't yet been explained. The girls were given simple tasks. Some fed the animals, others swept porches or hauled buckets of water. Kozue was handed a rag and told to wipe down the windows of the barn kitchen. The glass was cloudy with dust. She worked in silence, unsure whether the job meant anything, unsure whether she meant anything. But when she was done, a guard handed her a biscuit, still warm. He didn't say a word, just nodded and walked away. The days settled into rhythm. Wake up, eat, work, eat again. Evenings brought the strange sound of music, banjos, harmonicas, even laughter. The first time she heard it, she crouched in the corner of the barn, heart racing. Laughter meant madness in wartime Japan. Laughter was what men did after cruelty. But here, no one was screaming, no one was bleeding. It was laughter without sharp edges. It didn't make sense. Then came the rifles. It started one afternoon, clear sky and the sun like a coin over the hills. The girls were led out to a flat field behind the barn. Wooden crates formed a line. Metal cans dangled from ropes. At first, Kozue thought it was punishment. Maybe finally they'd be lined up. Her throat went dry. Her fingers twitched toward the blanket folded at her waist. But no commands came. Just a cowboy, thin, freckled, grinning like a schoolboy, holding up a long, polished rifle. "Target practice," he said in slow, clear English, gesturing with a wide sweep of his hand. "For fun." Fun? One of the braver girls, Aiko, a tall girl from Osaka with a dry wit and fierce eyes, stepped forward. She wasn't afraid of anything. Kozue had seen her argue with guards, tease them even. She always walked like the war had missed her somehow. A cowboy handed her the rifle. She turned it over in her hands like it was a sword from a fairy tale. They showed her how to hold it, how to aim. She leaned into it, narrowed her eyes, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot startled everyone. Kozue's heart slammed into her ribs. She took a step back, nearly stumbled. Aiko missed. The cowboy laughed and pointed to the next target. She adjusted, fired again. This time the can spun backward, dancing on the rope. Aiko let out a sharp, wild sound, half laugh, half cry, and turned to look at the others. She was smiling. Kozue felt her chest tighten. It wasn't the gun. It was the smile. What kind of prisoner smiled after firing a weapon handed to her by the enemy? What kind of world allowed that? When it was Kozue's turn, she didn't step forward. She shook her head once, firmly. A guard asked again. She refused. The cowboy shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. But Kozue couldn't look away. As the others took turns, awkwardly, laughing, cursing in Japanese, she sat on the edge of the fence, watching. The gunshots echoed through the field, but none of them made her flinch any more. That, somehow, made it worse. A rifle wasn't supposed to be a toy. A smile wasn't supposed to follow a shot. She clenched her fists in her lap, nails biting into her palms. This was all wrong. The world she had trained for had no room for this softness, this absurdity. But as Aiko hit another can, spun it clean off the rope, and bowed dramatically to her audience, Kozue felt something shift, not in the sky or the wind or the others. In herself. She was afraid, yes, but not of the gun. She was afraid of what it meant to want to try. The next morning, the sun broke over the hills in streaks of pale orange, casting long shadows over the barn roof. Kozue sat on her cot, legs drawn up beneath her, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She hadn't slept. The sound of metal hitting metal, of girls laughing into the recoil of American rifles, still rang in her ears. That smile on Aiko's face, free, unburdened, had taken up space inside her chest like smoke that wouldn't clear. After breakfast, oatmeal, sliced peaches, and hot coffee she still didn't understand how to enjoy, the same cowboy from yesterday waved her over again. His name was Walt. She remembered because someone had said it like a punchline. Walt walks slower than a cow in July. He had soft eyes and boots older than she was. "You want to try?" he asked. Kozue didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. That was enough. Walt led her down the dusty path to the range. The others weren't there today. It was quiet, save for the breeze pulling at the long grass and the occasional clink of a cowbell in the distance. He didn't rush, didn't talk much. He placed the rifle on a wooden stand like it was something sacred. She stood with her arms folded across her chest. He picked up the rifle and turned to her. "It's not heavy," he said, "but it'll kick if you fight it." Then, with a patient sort of kindness, he walked her through it. "Hold it here. Rest your cheek. See the sight? Right there. Deep breath in." She did as told, slowly, carefully. The weight surprised her, not crushing but deliberate. It had balance. She adjusted her stance the way he showed her. Her hands shook just slightly. "Now," he said, stepping back, "breathe out." She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder in a valley. The recoil pushed against her shoulder, not violently, but enough to remind her she was alive. The metal can on the rope barely wobbled. She blinked. Her heart raced. Her arms felt light, almost floating. Walt smiled. "Good, again." She fired once more. This time the shot was smoother, controlled. Her breath lined up with the trigger. Her shoulders didn't jolt. She missed, but something else hit. It wasn't power, exactly. It was clarity. For once, her body moved in a way that wasn't reactive. She wasn't flinching from sound or shrinking from orders or bracing for impact. She was choosing. Every second of the shot was hers alone. But with that clarity came something sharper, confusion. When she lowered the rifle, her chest tightened. What was this feeling? Not joy, not fear, something worse. She looked at her hands. They weren't trembling. They were steady, too steady. She turned away from Walt, angry without knowing why. He didn't push. He simply handed her a small cloth to wipe her hands and leaned against the fence, humming some tune she couldn't place. Kozue sat down in the dirt, pressing the cloth into her palms like it could erase. The heat of the trigger. Her stomach twisted. Shame rose in her throat. What kind of girl, what kind of prisoner, felt pride in shooting? What kind of person felt good at something meant to kill? And then, from her own mouth, it slipped out. A laugh, soft, unplanned, cracked at the edges. It escaped like breath after too long under water. She froze, horrified. Walt didn't react. Just glanced over and gave a faint, knowing nod, like someone who'd seen people do things they didn't understand yet. Kozue stared down at the ground, mortified. That laugh didn't belong to her. Not to the girl who had survived Nagoya, not to the body that had knelt beside dying boys in hospital barracks. That laugh belonged to someone looser, lighter, and she hated that it had found its way out. But later, as she lay on her cot and stared up at the rafters, the feeling of the rifle still in her arms, one thought returned, stubborn as a splinter. She hadn't felt afraid. Not once. That realization followed Kozue back to the barracks like a shadow that refused to detach itself. It clung to her as she washed her hands at the basin, as she folded her blanket with military precision, as she lay staring at the wooden rafters above her cot. Fear had shaped every moment of her life for as long as she could remember. Fear of hunger, fear of orders, fear of failing her country. And yet, standing in the open field with a rifle in her hands, something had shifted. The fear had not vanished, but it had loosened its grip. The next morning she returned to the range without being asked. The rifle waited where it always did, resting against the fence like an afterthought. She lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and felt its familiar weight settle into her arms. No one instructed her this time. No one hovered. The field was quiet except for the wind moving through tall grass. She positioned her feet, aligned her shoulders, and breathed the way she had been taught. Inhale, hold, release. The shot rang out clean and sharp. She lowered the rifle and exhaled slowly. Her hands did not tremble. She realized then that she had begun to associate the act not with violence, but with presence. When she held the rifle, her mind did not wander to memories of bombed streets or bodies on stretchers. It stayed with the now, with breath, balance, intention. The weapon had become a kind of anchor, grounding her in her own body for the first time in years. Other girls began to watch. A few sat nearby, pretending not to look. Some whispered, some frowned. Aiko stood off to the side, arms crossed, observing with quiet curiosity. Later, she approached Kozue and said, almost accusingly, "You look different when you hold it." Kozue didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to explain that the rifle didn't make her feel dangerous. It made her feel whole. That evening, she took a pencil and a scrap of paper from her cot. The camp allowed letters, they had said. She had not believed she would ever write one. Her hands hovered over the page. What could she say? That she was alive? That she was fed? That she was learning to aim instead of hide? She wrote slowly, carefully, as if each word carried weight enough to shatter her past. "Mother, I am alive. I am not hurt. They treat us well." She stopped there. The truth pressed against her chest, heavy and unmanageable. She wanted to write about the rifle, about how her hands no longer shook, about the strange kindness of the men who taught her to aim at nothing, but she feared what such words might do if read by the wrong eyes. So she folded the paper and tucked it away, unfinished. Around her, the camp had begun to change, not in structure, but in tone. Laughter surfaced more often, hesitant at first, then freer. The women spoke in low voices at night, sharing fragments of their former lives. Aiko admitted she had once dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher. Another girl confessed she missed the smell of rain on stone. These were not confessions of guilt or shame. They were fragments of humanity reassembling themselves. And always, beneath those whispers, ran the unspoken truth. They were changing. The rifle, once a symbol of terror, had become something else. Not a weapon, but a mirror. It reflected back a version of themselves they had been taught to bury, capable, steady, alive. The realization unsettled Kozue more than any fear. If she could stand unafraid with a weapon in her hands, what else had she been wrong about? That night, as she lay on her cot, the sounds of the camp settling around her, she stared at the ceiling and thought of the girl she had been before the war. The one who believed obedience was safety, the one who thought survival meant silence. That girl felt far away now. And in the quiet, with the memory of the rifle's weight still warm in her palms, Kozue understood something she had never allowed herself to consider before. The enemy had not taken her strength. They had given it back. At least, that's what she believed, until the targets changed. It was a humid afternoon, the kind where sweat clung to your skin before you even stepped outside. Kozue walked to the range like she had every day that week, the rifle resting easily in her arms now, no longer a foreign object. Walt was already there, setting up the targets with a quiet efficiency. Only this time there were no cans, no bottles. Instead, he placed upright silhouettes, shaped like men. Broad shoulders, narrow waists, human. Kozue froze. The blood in her legs turned to ice. For a moment the horizon spun, the ranch folding back into the hospital in Nagoya, into the screaming, the smoke, the mangled limbs. The silhouette wasn't wood and paper anymore. It was her brother, Satoshi, standing tall in his uniform. The same slant of the shoulders, the same proud angle of the chin. She took one step back, and then another. Beside her, one of the girls gasped. Another whispered, "No!" Then, from the far end of the line, a sound broke through. Short, sharp, sobbing. It was Misaki, a soft-spoken girl from Hiroshima who had never once held the rifle steady. She collapsed to her knees, face in her hands, shoulders shaking. No one moved to comfort her. They all stood in a silence so thick it swallowed the birdsong. Walt turned slowly, confusion settling into his features. He glanced at the targets, then at the girls. Realization hit like a slow wind. He stepped forward, removed his hat, and knelt next to Misaki without touching her. "I didn't think," he said quietly. "I should have." Kozue could barely breathe. Her fingers had clenched so tightly around the rifle that the wood dug into her palms. She hadn't fired a shot. She couldn't. Because the moment she had seen that shape, her mind had snapped, not into rage, but into memory. She remembered the last time she saw Satoshi, saluting their father as he boarded the truck bound for the coast. He had winked at her, playfully, promised to return with American medals strung around his neck. He never came back. They never recovered his body. And now she was standing here, heart hammering, pointing a rifle at a silhouette that bore his ghost. Guilt wrapped around her like a cold blanket. Why are we safe, she thought, while they burned? It was a question she couldn't voice, but she saw it in the eyes of the others. Survivors, not heroes, just the lucky ones. Later that night, Kozue found herself walking the perimeter of the barn, unable to sleep. The moon cast pale, silver light over the dry earth. She saw Walt sitting on the porch steps, his hat in his hands, face unreadable in the dark. He didn't speak at first, just nodded when she approached. "I wasn't trying to hurt nobody," he said eventually. "We use those for practice. Out here, it's just targets." Kozue sat down beside him. The wood creaked under her weight. She didn't respond right away. Her English was still patchy, but she understood the apology beneath the words. Not for the weapon, not even for the war, but for forgetting what it had cost them to survive it. He looked at her. "You want to go back to Cannes?" She nodded once. He smiled, just faintly. "Good. Me too." They sat there for a while, neither needing to fill the silence. For the first time, Kozue realized he didn't fully understand her past, and maybe never would, but he respected it. That was enough. Later, back in her cot, she traced the curve of her palm, still faintly marked by the rifle's grain. She thought about the faces that had surfaced, unbidden, in that moment of aim. Satoshi, the boys on the stretchers, her own reflection, warped by grief and guilt. Tomorrow she would shoot again, but only at bottles, only at the past. It was Walt's idea, of course. He called it a friendly contest, as if friendship was something they could win like a prize. The word rolled off his tongue like dust off a saddle, casual and strange, but the announcement lit a small fire in the camp, just enough to shift the air. They hung paper targets, drew chalk lines in the dirt. The sky stretched blue and endless overhead, and the sun gleamed off the barrels of rifles lined up like promises. The girls stood in a row, squinting into the light, nervous energy bubbling beneath their stiff shoulders. For the first time, they weren't just survivors or students or ghosts of the war. They were competitors. Aiko elbowed Kozue playfully. "You win, you owe me your bread tomorrow." Kozue rolled her eyes but didn't answer. Her focus was already pulling inward, tracing the familiar path of breath and balance. She didn't want to win. Not really, but she didn't want to flinch either. The first shots cracked the silence. Laughter followed. Not mocking or cruel, but delighted, uncontrollable. When Yumi missed her target entirely and stumbled backward from the recoil, the others erupted. Even the guards, standing a few paces back, chuckled under their breath. Someone whistled. Someone cheered. Kozue stepped up. She inhaled, exhaled, fired. The can spun. The paper tore. The circle hit clean through. Cheers. Light clapping. And for the first time, she didn't shrink from it. The contest stretched on, round after round. Walt tallied scores in chalk on a board he leaned against the fence. When it was over, he tapped the dusty wood with the back of his hand and called out, "Champion, Kozue." She blinked. Someone whooped. He pulled a blue ribbon from his pocket, frayed, simple, the kind you'd find at a county fair, and walked it over with mock ceremony. "For deadly aim and deadly silence," he teased. Kozue took it with numb fingers. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what winning meant here, in a place where nobody had asked her to be the best. But the ribbon hung soft between her fingers, the color of summer skies and old dreams. That night, Aiko offered her a trade. "You want to be a ghost or a girl?" she asked, holding up a tube of lipstick, barely used. Cherry red, illegally smuggled from a nurse's drawer, or maybe traded from one of the guards. No one ever asked. Kozue hesitated, then nodded. She passed the ribbon to Aiko without regret. It had served its purpose. Later, in the cracked mirror by the water basin, she pressed the lipstick to her lips with a trembling hand. The color startled her. Too bold, too alive. But when she stepped back and caught her reflection, something inside her shifted. She didn't look like a soldier or a ghost. She looked like someone returning to herself. The other girls whistled, clapped. Even Walt gave a half salute, grinning like a proud uncle. Kozue laughed, not because she meant to, but because she couldn't Help it." The sound escaped her chest like it had been waiting for years, and that laugh, it did something no bullet ever could. It cracked the wall inside her, the one built from fear, from loss, from duty that had no room for joy. It let in light, and with it came memory, not of pain, but of girlhood, of days before uniforms and hunger, of being seen. That night she folded the lipstick tube into a handkerchief and placed it beneath her pillow. A talisman, proof that transformation didn't come all at once, but in pieces, in paper ribbons and borrowed smiles. She was still Kozue. But now, when she walked through the camp, people didn't just glance at her. They saw her. And somehow, that was the most frightening thing of all. For years, Kozue had survived by shrinking, by folding herself smaller than the pain, quieter than the fear, lighter than the attention that followed weakness like a shadow. To be seen now, truly seen, felt like standing in open daylight after a lifetime underground. The camp hadn't changed overnight, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer walked with her shoulders curved inward. She didn't flinch at footsteps behind her. And when she spoke, others listened. It happened on a morning so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. The sun was low, the dust still cool beneath their shoes. The rifles lay lined on the bench, as they always did. But this time, when Walt called for volunteers to help the newer girls learn, his eyes landed on Kozue. "Think you can show them?" he asked, casual as ever. She hesitated, just a breath, then nodded. The girl they brought forward was younger, maybe 16. Her name was Hana. She had been quiet since arriving, her eyes always searching the ground, her hands clasped so tightly together they trembled. Kozue recognized the look instantly. It was the same look she had worn weeks ago, the look of someone bracing for something terrible. Kozue stepped beside her, took the rifle gently, and demonstrated how to hold it, not with authority, with care. "Like this," she said softly, guiding the girl's hands. "Let it rest. Don't fight it." Hana nodded, swallowing hard. Kozue could feel her fear through the thin cotton of her sleeve. She remembered her own first moment, the way the world had gone quiet, how her breath had forgotten how to move. She remembered thinking the rifle would decide who she was. She leaned in slightly. "It won't hurt you," she said. "You are in control." The words surprised her as she spoke them, not because they were untrue, but because she believed them. The shot cracked the air. Hana flinched, then blinked. The target wobbled. She laughed, startled, half in disbelief. Kozue found herself smiling in response. It was not triumph they shared, but relief. The relief of surviving a fear that had once ruled them both. Later, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the field, Kozue sat alone with the rifle resting across her knees. She ran her fingers along the wood, tracing the grooves worn by countless hands before hers. American hands, hands that had been taught to fight for reasons different than hers. And yet here she was, holding the same object, feeling something entirely different. The contradiction weighed on her. She had been raised to believe that the enemy stripped you of your humanity, that surrender was shame, that power belonged only to those who took it by force. But here she was, holding a weapon not as a threat, but as a lesson, not to destroy, but to understand herself. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who bowed too deeply, spoke too softly, swallowed fear, until it became part of her breath. That girl would never have imagined this moment, would never have believed that the enemy would offer her a rifle and trust her not to turn it on them. Trust. The word echoed in her mind, heavy and strange. As the sun dipped below the hills, she handed the rifle back to Walt. He took it with a nod, not a word spoken. Respect, she realized, didn't always come with ceremony. Sometimes it was simply the absence of fear. That night, lying on her cot, Kozue stared at the ceiling and thought of all the things she had been told she was. Weak, replaceable, silent. She turned onto her side and smiled faintly in the dark. If the people she had been taught to fear could hand her a rifle and say, "Try," then perhaps the stories she had lived by were not truths at all, just cages dressed up as duty. And if those walls could crack, even a little, then maybe something else was possible. Something like becoming herself again. Are you finding this story as powerful as we are? If so, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. She wrote it the way you only write something once, not with caution or fear, but with the strange, trembling clarity that comes after you realize you've been living a lie. Kozue sat on the edge of her bunk, the camp quiet in that hour between dinner and lights out, and put pencil to paper like she was stitching a wound that had gone too long untreated. "I was handed a rifle," she began, the words looping carefully in her uneven script. "Not to kill, not to be tested, but because they trusted me." She wrote about the bottles, about the laughter, about Hannah's trembling hands and her own steady ones. She wrote about lipstick and blue ribbons and sunlight across the range. She did not lie, and for the first time in her life, she did not censor her truth to match what someone else wanted her to believe. The letter never made it home. It was intercepted, routed through Tokyo, reviewed by Japanese intelligence still clinging to the ruins of war. The words were studied, translated and passed between hands with furrowed brows. It didn't make sense. A girl, a prisoner, talking about rifles as if they were gifts. Describing Americans like mentors, trusting the enemy. It was dangerous. One officer circled the phrase, "They let me aim without watching me." He scrawled a note in the margin. "Propaganda?" Another shook his head. "Or worse, truth." The letter was marked, copied, then filed away where things that shouldn't exist often went, into silence. Back at the ranch, unaware that her words had been deemed too disruptive to survive, Kozue folded a duplicate copy and tucked it into the lining of her boot. It sat there, close to her skin, warming with her steps, a hidden declaration of self. Not meant for the world, just for her. That week, a photographer arrived. He wore a U.S. Army badge and a tired smile, and the guards told the girls it was for documentation. To show the world you're being treated well. They lined up beneath the oak trees, shirts tucked, hair combed. Some smiled, some didn't. When it was her turn, Kozue stood with her rifle. It wasn't staged, she chose it. Walked up holding the rifle with the ease of habit, the butt resting just lightly against her hip. The photographer looked uncertain for a moment, then nodded and raised the camera. She didn't smile, she didn't frown. She looked directly into the lens, steady, unmoved. Click. The image would go into archives, years later misfiled and mislabeled. No one would know her name. The caption would read, "Female POW, Texas, 1945. No mention of the letter. No mention of the truth. Just a black and white freeze frame of a girl halfway between who she was and who she might become. And maybe that was fitting, because Kozue didn't know who she was anymore either. Not the obedient daughter, not the medic wrapped in ideology, but not quite American, not quite free. She had been trusted with a rifle, yes, but not yet with her future. That remained out of frame, waiting to be developed. Back in her bunk, she ran her fingers across the boot's lining, feeling the shape of the letter folded within. She whispered the words of it to herself, like a prayer for no one but her. "I am not who I was," she murmured, "but I don't know who I am." And outside, the Texas wind moved across the field, indifferent to names, to flags, to lines drawn in dirt. Only the truth remained, tucked in boots, caught in film, spoken in a voice steadier than she ever thought it could be. The day they left was like any other. No trumpets, no salutes. The sun rose indifferent, the cattle grazed near the fence line, and breakfast was boiled potatoes with cornbread. Yet something in the air felt final. Even the dust seemed to move slower. They were given 1 hour to pack. Kozue sat on her cot, motionless at first. She looked around the barracks, not grand, not comfortable, but theirs. The scratches on the wood bunk, the fading chalk tally marks on the wall from Iko's failed bread rations, the soft creak of the floorboard near the window. Every sound held a memory. She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out 3 things. A harmonica, dented and quiet, which she had never learned to play but loved to hold. A thin wool blanket, still faintly smelling of lavender from that time they washed it in stolen bath water and laughed so hard their sides ached. And a spent rifle shell, the very first one. The casing was warm in her palm despite the morning chill. She had kept it, hidden, not as a souvenir of war, but of something stranger. Her first act of choice, her first moment of control. Outside, the girls lined up in their civilian clothes, Japanese garments, restored with patches and threadbare seams. They had come to the camp looking like shadows. Now they stood taller, heavier in presence, if not in weight. Kozue stepped into line without speaking. Walt waited near the bus, hat low over his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just nodded once as she passed. A simple thing, but somehow it was more than enough. She stopped just briefly, nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. The engine coughed, rumbled, then groaned into motion. As the ranch faded behind her, Kozue didn't cry, but her throat tightened in a way that felt like mourning, not for what was lost, but for what had finally, quietly, been found. On the road, the windows rattled and the girls spoke in hushed tones, guessing at what would come next. Some dreamed of seeing their families again. Some feared what Japan had become without them. Kozue said nothing. She turned the rifle shell over in her hand again and again. She had come to America barefoot, starving, convinced she would die. She was leaving heavier, not just in muscle, not just with more color in her cheeks, but heavier with memory, with questions, with truths too complicated for uniform reports. She didn't know what Japan would make of her now. What would they see when she stepped off the ship? A survivor? A traitor? A girl who had eaten American food, worn American shoes, held an American rifle? Would they read her silence as shame or as strength? She didn't know. All she knew was this: she had arrived empty, hollowed out by war, shaped by fear, and now, tucked into her bag, were no medals, no trophies, just peace in fragments, a blanket, a shell, a song never played. And maybe that was enough. As the bus turned toward the coast and the Texas plains rolled out behind her like an old dream, Kozue pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered to herself, not a goodbye, but a promise, that the girl who had learned to shoot, to speak, to be, would not disappear when the ship crossed the ocean. Not again. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.